In this segment, we'll be looking at the typical mortise cylinder lock. Now, mortise cylinder locks are commonly used in doors and homes, among other applications as well, but the most common use of them is indoors. You can see on the back side here, we have a lever which allows the mechanism to work. So as you turn the key, you're going to move that lever. Now let's take a look how that works. So to operate the lock, what we would do is we would put the key in the lock, and as you turn the key, you can see it turns the lever on the back of the lock. So that's what opens and releases the lock mechanism itself, is when we put the key in, that allows it to turn the lever, and that releases the lock on the door. Now in a typical mortise lock, what you'll notice is you have threads here that run along the outside of the lock. That's what helps it retain it in the door itself. As you look around this threaded area, you can see one area here is milled out, and there's actually a flat metal plate that's placed in there. Now this flat metal plate, what that does is cover the top holes of the lock. So the pins that go down into the lock are actually holes that are drilled down below this plate. You can see that lines up with the plug here, so your top pins would be right above the key slot. So what happens is when they make the lock, they drill those holes, they mill the slot out, and then to keep the springs and pins on the lock, there's a plate that actually covers over the top of the hole here. Now if you ever had to get this plate out, the trick to it here is, if you can see, it's actually slid in from the back. If you try to pry it up, it's not going to work. It doesn't pry in from the top, it actually slides out the back. And usually what they do with the manufacturer is they'll peen over the end here a little bit with a hammer so it locks it in place. So to get this plate out, if you ever had to, you'd actually have to file off the back of the lock here a little bit and then pry the plate out towards the back. Now the tool that we use to get the plug out is made of nylon or plastic, and you can see it has a little notch milled in the end of it. And how this works is we would take the plate off the end of the lock, and you can see there's a little tab that fits into that plate. That tab will fit into the slot of our plug follower tool here. So what we do is we line that up, and then we can push this plug through as it pushes the lock cylinder out. As this goes through, the top pins and springs will be held in place by the plastic plug here, follower. That way they won't come out of the lock. So what we can really do is unbolt that, slide that plug out carefully, and take our plug out and change the lower pins without disturbing the top pins. Now it's important that we keep good pressure on this when we push through. Keep steady pressure so we don't allow any of those pins to drop out. And then once we get it in, we don't want to pull this plug out. If you pull this plug out without having a cylinder in there, all the pins are going to fall out of the lock. So let's disassemble this lock. The first step we're going to do is remove these two screws that are in the back. There's two Phillips head screws that hold this plate on. What we do is take a screwdriver, take the plate off. So we take each of the screws out, carefully pull them out. Now while I'm doing this, you can see on the bottom here I have my finger on the bottom of the plug here, so I keep that from dropping down. So once we remove this plate, we don't want the plug to fall out of the lock. So we take the screws out, be careful you don't lose them. Now for this plug to slide out, we have to have all the pins on the shear line, so we have to insert our key into the lock. You can do this ahead of time, or you can do it after you've gotten the plate off. Either way is fine. Okay, now that we have the plate off, we have our key inserted. We have our plug follower tool lined up with the notch. We should be able to slide that plug right out by pushing the tool into the lock. Now when we do this, we want to make sure that our pins are up. See pins here in the top. So when we slide out, the pins don't go flying. You can see it slides right out. Now this part of the lock, what we want to do is keep that plug follower in there. Don't let that plug follower fall out. If that plug follower falls out, then what's going to happen is all your top pins and springs are going to come out, and we're going to end up rebuilding the lock. And as long as that plug follower stays in, then our top pins, springs will all stay in place, and we won't have to worry about it. Now if we look a little closer at the plug, we'll see our bottom pins that are all located in the holes that are in the plug. Notice there's an extra hole here. You normally see that last pin is empty. Now the other thing you notice is we have our key in the plug, and you can see that all these pins line up flush at the top. See how that's all flush and even. So that allows the shear line to be right in line for all the pins, and that's what allows us to turn this plug in the lock. If one of these pins was up or down in the hole, the pins would jam in the lock then and wouldn't allow it to turn, which is what happens if you don't have the right key in the lock. You can see as we move the key in and out, you can see the pins moving. If we were to take the key right out, you can see all the pins are different depths. But as we put the key into the lock, what we'll see then is we'll get all the pins will rise up and be all nice and flush in the top here. Now to change the combination, what we would do is we can just basically take the key out, we can dump out the pins, and then what we can do is reload new pins into the lock for our new combination. Once you get the plug out of the lock, you can dump the bottom pins out. Now the bottom pins are going to be the pins with the rounded ends on them. You can see that there's a set of pins here. You can see the ones on the left are top pins, and you can see they're flat on each side and they're all the same length. Bottom pins usually have a taper on one end, and you can see that there are different lengths depending on your key combination. We also of course have a spring here on the left side that is used in a lock. Hopefully that didn't come apart when you pulled a lock apart, but if it did, you'd have to replace the top spring as well. To change the key combination, we're basically changing the bottom pins. So we'll change these with different lengths depending on what key code we want to use for the new lock. The deeper the cut in the key, the longer the bottom pin will need to be to match it all up on the shear line. This, of course, likewise, the shorter the cut in the key, the shorter the bottom pin we'll use. So once we select a new combination, we can get the pins to match the key, and we're all set to put the lock back together. Okay, at this point what we have done is put new bottom pins in the lock, so we have a different key combination now. So once we have the pins in, you can see the left hole here is left blank. We have the other 5 pins in. We've also made a key to fit this new combination. And we can double check it before we put the lock together by putting the key in, and we can see that they all do in fact line up nice and flush on the top. Now to put the lock back together, it's basically the reverse of taking it apart. What we're going to do is get our mortise cylinder here, make sure the plug follower stays in here, make sure it doesn't come out. And what we want to do is line the tab back up in the plug follower, and then we can slide this in. And be careful, keep a little tension on the plug follower so it doesn't bump it right out easily. And just slide it right back together. And you can see our plug is back in here. And what we can do from now is put the tab back on, put the screws back in. Make sure you hold this in until you get that on, because it'll slide right back out on you. So you want to make sure you hold pressure in here, attach our retaining tab back on here with the 2 screws, tighten it up, and then you're all set. Now you have a mortise lock that has a new key combination.